Hello, and welcome back to Write America. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lauren, Book Review's publicist and events coordinator. I am thrilled to be here for week 6 of the series featuring the fabulous Allen and Arlene Alda. So if you missed any of the episodes of Write America so far, you can go to Book Review's Crowdcast channel at any time and watch the recordings. Tonight's episode is also going to be recorded, so if you know anyone who couldn't make it this evening, they'll have an opportunity to watch it too, so you can just share the link with them. I believe it might be mirrored up here somewhere. There's a little share button. You can get the link and send it off to anybody that you'd like. But before we get started, I just want to give you a little tour around Crowdcast just in case this is your first time here. Right below the stream in this general direction, there is going to be a button that says that you can purchase signed copies of Allen and Arlene's books. So you can click that button and go right to bookreview.com where you can buy a selection of titles signed by Allen and Arlene. There is also an Ask a Question button down here. If you have a question for Allen and Arlene during their readings, you can just drop them right down below and we'll get to them at the end of the stream during the audience Q&A portion. And I see that some of you have found the chat and are dropping all your comments in there. Please continue to do that. Talk amongst yourselves, discuss the readings, drop your virtual applause in the chat over there so that Allen and Arlene can see you because we can't hear you. But yeah, so thank you all so much for tuning in tonight, and we are going to get started. Allen Alda is a 7-time Emmy Award winner who has starred in, written, and directed many films. He played Hawkeye Pierce and wrote many of the episodes on the classic TV series MASH and appeared in continuing roles on ER, The West Wing, 30 Rock, The Blacklist, and Horace and Pete. His interest in science led to his hosting the award-winning PBS series Scientific American Frontiers for 11 years, on which he interviewed hundreds of scientists. He is a visiting professor at Stony Brook University's Allen Alda Center for Communicating Science, which has trained over 15,000 scientists and doctors around the world. So sitting in conversation with Allen tonight is his better half, Arlene. Arlene Alda graduated from Hunter College, received a Fulbright scholarship, and realized her dream of becoming a professional clarinetist, playing in the Houston Symphony under the baton of Leopold Stokowski. She switched careers when her children were young and became an award-winning photographer and author who has written 19 books, including Just Kids from the Bronx. So, without further ado, let's welcome to the screen Allen and Arlene Alda.
Hello, thank you, Lauren.
Hi.
Are we half a screen
We're half
or
a
all
screen.
a screen?
No, you're good. You're good. I'm gonna
Okay.
turn it over to you. Have fun. I'm so excited.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
So I'm Alan and this is Arlene, just so you don't get confused.
And before we do anything else,
Yeah,
I really want to thank Lauren and thank Lauren from Book Review and all her team, and of course Roger Rosenblatt, whose brainchild this is. Thank you so much.
thank you for asking.
Write
me.
America.
So interestingly, the authors who are reading on this series, I think, have been asked to read something associated or vaguely associated with our current times in our country, which I think is why it's called Write America. And in vague ways and sometimes not so vague ways, I think that's what we've chosen to read.
Well, Roger was wonderful in that he gave us complete carte blanche.
Right.
So,
So I took the cart, you took the blanche.
so I chose to read from a book of oral histories that I wrote and put together called Just Kids from the Bronx, which is very dear to my heart in many, many ways. The impetus for the book basically was me coming from the Bronx and then meeting for the first time a fellow Bronxite, Mickey Drexler, who I had never met before. And not only was he from the Bronx, but he was from the building, the same exact building where I grew up and where I found out he also grew up. And the building was large. There were 96 apartments And I was on one side of the building, he was on the other side. There was an elevator in the middle. He was on the first floor. He never used the elevator. I was on the second floor. I did. But more importantly, I think it was the age difference that separated us. I am 11 years older than Mickey. And when he was a toddler, I was already in high school. So never our paths
But did you
crossed.
babysit for him?
No, I babysat for his cousin Barry. So,
So
in the
once
same apartment.
when you met him, that was the night that you both decided to go back to the Bronx and explore where you came from.
Yeah.
And from that
Mickey
came
and
your book.
that was how the book started. Mickey and I went back to the building. You were with us.
Yeah.
Cousin Barry was with us, and a couple of Mickey's friends. And it was really a wonderful visit, not in terms of sentimentality at all. There was an excitement in that here was the beginning of our growing up and our moving out. You know, when you came from the Bronx in those days, what you wanted to do was move to Manhattan when you got old enough. Not everyone, but a number of us. Manhattan was Mecca. And that was Mickey's experience, and that was my experience too. But it was really interesting. It was exciting and beautiful. And Mickey started telling stories about his childhood. And I thought, this is too beautiful to let go. There are oral histories out there, not just of this building, but of people who grew up in the Bronx. So I started with friends, Mickey and Regis Philbin and Marty Bregman. And
How many people did you finally interview?
over 60.
Wow.
Yeah. And I learned so much. It was extraordinary.
What I love about it is it's, in a way, a history of the Bronx through decades, but always as seen through the eyes of children, because these are stories of them growing up in the Bronx. So you see
Right.
the history of the borough through their eyes.
Right. But they're through the eyes of the grown-up looking back
Remembering
at
as
the
a child.
childhood.
Read one. What do you have?
Yeah,
What-
so and a lot of the stories are very humorous. A lot of them are very pensive and thoughtful, depending on who was talking. And so I thought I would read a little bit of a few that struck me as having a lovely and somewhat funny anecdotes. This is Carl Reiner, who recently passed away, and we were privileged to be able to be his friend, and we loved Carl very much. But here's Carl talking about his childhood. He said, "I could make kids laugh when I was very young, and I liked doing it. When I was in first grade at PS 57, I was the teacher's pet. At Christmas, they asked, 'Can anyone do anything entertaining?' One kid got up and tap danced, and I could stand on one leg behind and put it behind my head and hop around on the other. It was one of those things I found that I could do because I had a short torso and long legs. I did that in our classroom, and then the teacher took me to 2 other classrooms to do it, and that was my first tour in show business right there. In 3rd grade, I played the headsman in the play. The slide is terrible. I can't read. 6 who six who pass while the lentils boil. I was the guy who chopped people's heads off. We performed the play for an audience, and all I remember is that my mother sat next to the principal, who said to her, "That boy is the best one." He said that because I was loud. I was the loudest one, and he could hear me. At Evander Childs High School, Mr. Raskin, who was the music teacher there, needed singers. So my friend Milton points to me and says, "He sings." I could sing loud and had a big operatic voice, but no ear and no timing. However, I could sing like Caruso if somebody conducted me. Raskin says, "Let me hear you sing." And he gives me a few notes to sing. I hit one note. "You're in," he said. What? What am I in? In the chorus. Then I was paired with a wonderful girl, coloratura Ruth, and we rehearsed the duet, "Yo soy el pato," which is "I am the duck" in English. In rehearsals, I sang it really well. This was for our big outing to be on stage at Julia Richmond High School in Manhattan for a Spanish festival. So we're there, and Ruth starts to sing, and I'm supposed to walk behind her on stage. While I'm doing that, I can't help myself. I'm doing it duck style. I'm flopping after her, and the audience is roaring with laughter. The more they roared, the more I both walk like a duck and jump like a duck. That was my first and only theatrical performance in high school, but by then I was bitten.
So that's interesting. You know, that leads into a piece from one of my books where I explain where it all began. Carl was talking about how he was bitten from walking like a duck.
Into showbiz.
And I, as Lauren has said earlier, I've spent a lot of my life in the last few decades figuring out what makes good communication and teaching it through the Center for Communicating Science at Stony Brook. And I wrote a book about communicating and the importance of relating to the people you're trying to communicate with. So therefore, the title of the book is, "If I Understood You, Would I Have This Look on My Face?" So in that book, I talk about the beginnings of my understanding of the need to relate and how not relating can lead to not only poor communication, but poor results for your whole life. It all began with my tooth. The dentist had the sharp end of the blade inches from my face. It was only then that he chose to tell me what he was seconds away from doing to my mouth. "There will be some tethering," he said. I froze. Tethering? My mind was racing. What does he mean? How could the word tethering apply to my mouth? He seemed impatient, and I didn't want to annoy him, but he was, after all, about to put a scalpel in my mouth. I asked him what he meant by tethering. He looked surprised, as if I should know the meaning of a simple word. He began barking at me. "Tethering, tethering," he said. I was well over the age of 50 and certainly old enough to ask him to put the knife down and answer a few questions. But there he was in his priestly surgeon's gowns and getting increasingly impatient. "Okay," I said, a little too accommodatingly. Then he put the scalpel in my mouth and cut. I didn't realize it then, but this was a watershed, what's that word? Watershed moment for me. For the rest of my life, I would be living with the results of these few seconds of poor communication, and in ways that were both good and bad. First, the bad. A few weeks later, I was acting in a movie. The camera was in close on me as I smiled. It was a relaxed, happy smile. And then after the take, the director of photography came over looking puzzled, and he said, "Why were you sneering? I thought you were supposed to smile." I said, I was smiling. He said, no, sneering. I looked in a mirror. There I was, sneering. My upper lip drooped lazily over my teeth, and no matter how I tried, I couldn't form an actual smile. The problem was my frenum. I didn't have one. In case you're not familiar with your frenum, it's just above your front teeth, between the gum and the inside of the upper lip. If you put your tongue at the top of your gums, above your front teeth, you'll feel a slim bit of connective tissue, or at least you will if a barking dentist hasn't been in your mouth. The tissue is called the maxillary labial frenum, and he had severed mine. The procedure was one that he had invented. It enabled him to pull a flap of gum tissue down over the socket of the front tooth that he had extracted. The idea was to give the socket a fresh blood supply while it healed. He was proud of his invention, and it seemed perfectly suitable for the gum's blood supply, but not so good for me using my face in movies. Without my frenum, my upper lip just hung there like a scalloped drape in the window of an old hotel. After the movie shoot, I called him and explained with saintly patience that I made a living with my face, and sometimes I needed one that could smile. His response was curt. I told you there were 2 steps to the procedure. I haven't done the second step yet. I was a little reluctant to let him do the second step. Maybe this time he'd have a go at the frenum under my tongue. I didn't have many frena left, and he seemed to have an unnatural attraction to them. The experience wasn't all bad, though. For one thing, I learned to work around my frenumless smile, and my new slightly off-kilter grin enabled me to play a whole new set of villains. Even better, that moment in the dentist's chair was a useful thing in ways that I wouldn't understand at the time. I've come to see my exchange with the dentist that day as something that happens frequently in life. A brief encounter that threatens the relationship's delicate tissue, the tender frenum of friendship. I wasn't looking for friendship that day, but at least I wanted the feeling that I was actually being seen by him and heard. Even though his gaze was intense, I realized that as far as he was concerned, I wasn't really there, not as a person. If I was there at all, I was something on his checklist. He was speaking in the vague mist of interpersonal nothingness. Those few minutes I spent in his chair have become a symbol for me of really, really poor communication and of what causes it. Disengagement from the person we hope will understand us. That disengagement can stand in the way of all kinds of happiness and success, from the world of business to the business of love. Not being truly engaged with the people we're trying to communicate with, and then suffering the snags of misunderstanding, is the grit that gets in the gears of daily life. I thank you. My mother thanks you. My father thanks you.
Yep.
You think that's true?
That your mother thanks you?
No, that what I read.
What you read. Yeah,
I think you and I have got better at it over the decades.
Well, it's interesting to me that in all the years you were acting and directing, which is definitely a basic view of communication, that you then took all those skills of listening as an actor to be able to get into a whole other field, understand that other field, and be able to elicit the best from the people who you were talking to, and then to actually create a program to make it possible to communicate better.
And it is true that the essence of the program is learning to listen the way actors have to learn to listen to each other on the stage. So I had that personal experience to build on.
Right.
And you listen to these 62 people, but it's interesting. When a person reads the book and doesn't have the advantage of sitting near you while you were writing it over many months, it's easy to miss the fact that your contribution was enormous. It wasn't a transcript of what they said.
Yeah.
It was carefully constructed. It's all their words, but you left out stuff that didn't contribute to the story. And everybody might have said to you, "We played stickball," but you only included that stickball element of life in the Bronx once or twice.
Well, it was a challenge as a writer, because basically I interviewed the people, most of whom I did not know. So we just started chatting. And when you chat a lot, there's a lot of words that kind of come into play, but not all of them fit into any particular story. So it was a real challenge to find what the story was within the interviews, within the talking, within the chatting, because I didn't have preconceived notions. I wasn't sure how I would craft the one story after another without being repetitious. And it wasn't until I had the bulk of the stories that I saw the chronology of the oldest to the youngest. And Carl was one of the oldest, and the youngest at that time was someone called Eric Zeiler, who was 23. And it, through those decades, and through the stories that they told, you kind of got a real feeling of what the Bronx was like during those times. There was an innocence to Carl's stories. There was a great deal of innocence, and then some surprises. Our friend David Yarnell surprised me because I know him quite well, and he talked about an adventure he had. I think I'll need the light again.
Oh, okay.
Adventure he had in the growing up, and he says, okay, he reminisces and then gets into something very specific. Starts off with a quote by Ogden Nash: "The Bronx, no thanks." Ogden Nash, that's one of the cynically recited, that's one that I cynically recited for a good part of my life. But I've changed my mind. I have great memories in spite of the awful rush hour rides on the loud and squeaky 241st Street IRT subway line. There were the fragrant, sweet smells from the Saperstein and Snowflake bakeries. And no Parisian patisserie produced a more luscious eclair than those two Jewish corners of heaven, especially when you bit into the outer shell and the inside custard released in all its glory. And then there were the delicatessens with their pickle barrels, the Italian grocery stores, lilacs growing wild in empty lots. Yes, lilacs. And in my restless teens, I found the tiny Ascot Theater in English. These experiences gave me a heady feeling of sophistication, since I was the self-proclaimed #1 expert in the Bronx on the work of the French actor Louis Jouvet. However, I knew that I wanted to get out of the Bronx when I actually lived there. In my mind, there were definitely better places like Greenwich Village in Manhattan. When I was a teenager, I would take the subway to Manhattan and go to jazz clubs. The Bronx didn't do it for me, except for the one summer that I was 16, when I led a double life, kind of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. There was the Pelham Parkway gang near where I lived. These were the Bronx High School of Science and Stuyvesant High School overachievers. They were the smart Jewish kids studying to be professionals. Then there was the Tremont Avenue gang. Tough street kids, knew how to hustle. They lived farther south on the White Plains Road line of the subway. I went back and forth between them. That summer, I was looking for something exciting and maybe even a bit dangerous. I had a cousin. He was a real daring, wild, great-looking guy. He was into jazz, dressing sharp, and smoking pot. Prompted by him and our friends in the Tremont Avenue gang, my friend Eugene and I decided that we would make some money by growing marijuana and then selling it. Now, mind you, readers, listeners, this is in the 1940s in the Bronx. Okay, very unusual. We staked out a plot of land 15 feet by 10 feet, about 300 feet inside Bronx Park, surrounded and isolated by bushes and trees. We planted the seeds in early spring, and they were watered by nature and a nearby drinking fountain. We would dash to our crop as soon as we got home from school, thrilled to see that the plants were really growing. We weren't totally successful as farmers. One of 3 plants survived, but we harvested and started the curing process. The buds of the plants were placed in quart pickle jars, then placed under my bed, carefully relocated on Fridays, cleaning day, to avoid discovery by my mother. The courier for the pot was Max, a Brooklyn College student who drove a hack in the summer, a taxi service, carrying New York City residents to the various Catskill Mountain hotels. I had met Max the previous year when he provided this service to my family on our annual trek to the mountains. His brother, a jazz trumpeter, opened the door to our customer base. These were the jazz musicians who were ready to improve their performance by smoking pot, weed, Mary Jane. All of this was a heady adventure that thrilled and scared the hell out of us. With the drop-off of a product to the Nevele Country Club and Klein's Hillside, we had a profit of $270 for both of us to split. And that was a lot in those days. Not bad for a summer's work. But our venture came with much more fear than I wanted. And when it was all over, I was much relieved. I went back to Christopher Columbus High School and hit the books.
And he became a very successful producer.
Yes.
Got out of the pot business.
He, I didn't know that in his early days he was a lawyer as well.
He went from breaking the law to administering it. That's great.
What kids will do. But so, Bronx Park, think of it. Bronx Park is one of the biggest parks in New York City. And it is a park. It's
it's a public park, and they're growing marijuana in the public.
Right. They were growing it near a water fountain that kids would go to and drink from. I recently went back and looked at that grove of trees and whatever, what he described.
Did you bring home any dope?
There was nothing to bring home.
Oh, my God. That's good. It would just go to waste. So I wanted to follow up. There's another section in the book, if I understood you would have this look on my face, where I talk about an element of communicating that's sometimes overlooked because, A, you do have to make contact with the other person. But in addition to that, it really helps if there are points of commonality between you that you can both become aware of. Becoming aware of of what you have in common turns out to be important. There was a couple of studies done in which a teacher and her students understood that they had 5 things in common. They liked the same songs or simple things. I like mustard on my sandwich or something like that. Knowing that they had 5 things in common improved the learning experience of the students, and their grades were higher. That's a very interesting finding. And to me, one of the most extraordinary examples of having something in common happened during the First World War. When Great Britain entered the war, many of the troops were sure they'd be home by Christmas. But as months went by and Christmas approached, they were still stuck in the trenches with icy puddles, rodents and lice and mold in their bread. After a while, the British noticed that the other side stopped firing around dinner time. And then an hour later, they would resume. The British took advantage of the lull to have their own meal. And a routine evolved. As if to emphasize that they were taking a time out from the war, both sides would fire furiously right up to the time the clock struck 5. And then there would be utter silence. At precisely 6 o'clock, the guns would begin again. Soon each side began making occasional offerings of a break in hostilities, whether or not it was dinner time. At one point, in a clear appeal to familiarity, there was a crucial bit of communication. A German voice called out, "We are Saxons. You are Anglo-Saxons. If you don't fire, we won't fire." By Christmas Eve, the similarities in the culture they shared were becoming hard to ignore. The British could hear the Germans singing Christmas carols. Malcolm Brown of the British War Museum quotes a soldier remembering what he heard from his position in a trench in La Chapelle d'Armentières. It was a beautiful moonlit night, frost on the ground, white almost everywhere. And about 7 or 8 in the evening, there was a lot of commotion in the German trenches. And there were these lights. The lights turned out to be candles burning on improvised Christmas trees. And then, the soldier recalled, they sang Silent Night. I'll never forget it. It was one of the highlights of my life. I thought, what a beautiful tune. The British soldiers answered the Germans by singing the first Noel, and they held up signs on which they had scrawled, "Have a happy Christmas." They sang through the night, matching each other, song for song. On Christmas morning, in many places along the front lines, men from both sides slowly climbed to the tops of their trenches, and they met in the middle of no man's land, where they exchanged cigarettes and offered one another schnapps and chocolates. In 3 or 4 places along the line, someone was able to come up with a ball, and placing their hats on the frozen ground to mark off a pair of goals, the 2 enemies played soccer. One British infantryman even had his hair cut by a man who had been his barber in London and was now a German soldier. There was a sense of relief and a measure of hilarity for both sides. This seemed like such a profound example of the power of commonality. If people are shooting at you and you repeatedly are getting their fire for months, and if reminding them that you share something in common can silence the guns for a while, something important is going on. There were, however, a few generals on both sides of the war with whom all this familiarity did not go over so well. They let the troops know that fraternization was treason, and from then on, the only time either side would climb out of the trenches was with fixed bayonets. In order to fight a war, which I would think is probably the most extreme form of poor communication, unfamiliarity is the preferred state of mind. Yeah. I read that because if the request tonight was to read something that applies to us today in our country. I can't think of anything that I worked on that better illustrates that, because we live at a time when there's big money in turning us into a pair of tribes that are unspeakable in several senses of the word. We don't speak to each other, and we regard the other one as beneath contempt. And we ignore the commonality that we share. And there's at least, there is several networks, both on the air and on the internet, that profit from doing that to us.
Yeah.
And it's not a crazy dream that you can get together again. They got together in 19, whatever it was, 17 or 18.
And after, the awfulness of war is that the day after, you pick up all the pieces and bury all the bodies, and then you shake hands.
Right, we're
and
rebuilding our enemies' towns again.
Yeah, it's the most futile of all endeavors, in my opinion, and the most insane, or one of the most insane. The concept of war, killing. We play chess every day. That's our version.
That's our version
of war, and we don't shoot.
So we have 20 more minutes. We could go to questions now, or
well, I'd love to.
What about Marty
to
Bregman?
just.
I love that one.
Which one?
Marty Bregman.
Well, I think I'd like to skip to. Marty had wonderful stories about his, Jewish boy dating an Italian girl, but the range of the book interests me still. I love, for instance, I interviewed 3 guys from a well-known graffiti group, and the group is called Tats Crew, and the guys have their tags. There's BG 183, Bio, and Nicer, and I interviewed the 3 of them together. What especially interested me, because not only am I separated, to your point, separated by years, but by culture and distance as well, and economics, and you name it, there's separation. When we started to talk, there was no separation at all.
Why was
they
that?
were,
In what way?
well, we were talking about growing up in the Bronx. Nicer, the guy called Nicer, talked about his Puerto Rican family, a big extended family, all in the neighborhood. I remember we had relatives in our neighborhood, some in our building, and the doors were never locked. At that time in New York, everyone was triple locking their doors, but these families felt perfectly secure, despite the fact that landlords were abandoning the buildings and arsonists were roaming and burning down that part of the Bronx, that part of the South Bronx. Anyway, I just loved listening to their stories of who they were and how they got to where they were. So the Nicer describes his family. In my family, I'm the first generation born here in the United States. That's why I'm from the Bronx. My family came over from Puerto Rico. My mother came over when she was 14 in 1950 something. They didn't speak much English. So when I was learning English, like in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, my mother and other relatives hovered over my homework books. They were learning English as I was learning it. So it was like a group session. We didn't think we were poor because we had everything we needed right there on the block. You had your friends, you had your family. I also had grandparents who lived 2 blocks over, and I had great aunts and great uncles there too. Doors were never locked. I would go over to a neighbor's house, open the front door and say, "Is Jose there?" Every tenement building was like its own little community, a little city within a city. My mother also went to school to learn English. She always struggled with having that real strong accent. It was very funny. It took me many years to figure out that the Yankees didn't start with a J.
The Yankees didn't start with a J.
And then BJ said, "I remember lunch hour when I was in second and third grade. Everybody was fighting. The teacher had no control over the kids. Kids just kicking and girls getting their hair pulled. It was like chaos. During that time, you had the era of the karate movies, so everyone's trying to kick, everyone's trying to imitate Bruce Lee. It was a real crazy time. But at the same time, I enjoyed it. It was my exercise for the day. So, I mean, these are kids who grew up in rough places.
What I think, I think what may have enabled you to see a commonality was that these guys who grew up, their play, as I remember, they would play by jumping out of an abandoned building onto mattresses that were laying on the ground.
Well,
below.
what happened was they would play in the abandoned buildings. They would play on tops of elevators. But one time in an abandoned building, the building started to crumble and the kid fell. And fortunately, his fall was broken by the garbage that was strewn below, which included a mattress.
Yeah.
I mean, it was
that's not what I meant by commonality. I don't think you had that. I don't think you had that. In spite of that kind of different background.
Yeah.
They were artists.
They were artists, and the school brought it out of them, and they knew they were artists from day one.
But they were artists with spray cans on trains. But I would love that moment where one of them says to you, "We painted the train and we knew it would go throughout all the boroughs of the city and take our art to places that we hadn't even thought
went from the Bronx through Manhattan into Brooklyn, and then back, and they would all see our art."
And those kids who were painting trains that they shouldn't have been painting with cans of paint that they had lifted from stores became world famous, and some of their work is in museums now. I think.
Yes. Yeah. They educated themselves. They worked hard. They describe, actually, I mean, it's a whole subculture that we meaning you and I and many other people, knew nothing about because we didn't like the graffiti. I mean, who wants to see a public thing to face?
Meant to some of these kids.
But getting to know them and seeing it from their point of view, there's something remarkable that in the human spirit and through art that made them survive, that drove them not to rob banks, not to deal drugs, but to go out there and perfect their art, which they did. By the way, I mean, this is nothing to do with defacing, but painting with a spray can is very, very hard to do.
Well, I think we better take questions. I'm glad I went to the Bronx and found you.
Well, you were in the Bronx too. That was so great. You went to Fordham, and I was, 2 bus rides away.
Yeah. We used to go, Lauren. We used to.
Hi, Lauren.
We'd finish off a date. I'd take Arlene home to the Bronx, and she'd give me bread to take home, rye bread for the subway ride, because it was an hour back to my house.
How sweet.
Then I'd wake up in Brooklyn. I'd sleep past my stop late at night. I wake up in Brooklyn, reach in my pocket. There were stale pieces of bread in my pocket.
Oh. That's so sweet. So one of the things, I mean, I'm just enjoying myself listening to you guys read and talk about your readings. And I see a couple of other people are wondering what I was wondering, which is, how did you guys meet?
I needed bread.
Almost.
We
At a
met.
friend's,
Tell.
at a mutual friend's dinner party. So there was bread, but more importantly, there was cake. And the hostess had baked a rum cake, put it on the top of the refrigerator in this little kitchen in a Manhattan little brownstone. And the refrigerator was old and rounded and it shook. And the rum cake gradually shook to the edge and plopped on the floor. And Alan and I
We're the only two people to pick up our spoons and eat it off the floor.
Match made in heaven.
And from that day
That's
to
how
this,
we
we
met.
eat off the floor. It's just a sentimental thing.
Oh my God, I love that. I love that so much. Oh my goodness. All right. Well, we have a ton of questions here for you, and only a little bit of time.
Are we both off camera? Should one of are you seeing us on camera?
I
Looks to
can
me
see
like
you both. You might want to scooch a little bit closer.
okay.
There you
Okay.
go.
like this.
That's
Come on in.
Let me see here.
Don't try anything funny.
Do all your authors do this?
No, this is the first. It's an event and date all in one. Oh my goodness. So Irene would like to know, she says, I know Arlene took a lot of pictures over the years on the set of MASH and Alan's movies. Are there any plans to release some of these never before seen pictures either in book form or online? Thank you.
There are 2 books.
Okay. Well, I think the operative words are never before seen, but there is a book.
Yeah, the books came out, but they're still never before seen.
But it came out at a funny time, and it kind of came and disappeared. It's called The Last Days of MASH. And Alan and I actually collaborated on the book. I took the pictures and I wrote captions of the pictures, but he has a commentary, a running commentary throughout the book. And we're both very proud of that book. I must say it's a very good book.
But it's out of print now.
Yeah, it may, everything is available somewhere.
Yeah, you can probably get an old copy on eBay for $1,000.
So if Irene would like to check, with Amazon or on the internet, the name of the book is The Last Days of MASH, and they cover the last week. It actually was an assignment that I had from Life magazine to shoot behind the scenes of those last 7 days of the program. So there was also a magazine. There was a 6-page spread in Life. That was 1983.
I don't remember.
Yeah, something like that. So anyway, that's all I know about that.
What you got another question?
Yeah, let me see. Oh, we have lots of questions. This one's from Caro. How do you see television's social impact today versus the era of the 1970s with shows like Sanford and Son and Maude, and of course, MASH?
That's a difficult question for me to ask because I don't watch much television. Network. I've almost no network television. And I don't know how much impact shows had in the 70s either, because we got credit for helping stop the Vietnam War, which I don't think is warranted. I think we reflected how the country felt. I don't think we helped the country feel a certain way. So I don't know. I can't talk about the impact because the impact that I see really pronounced is not in fictional shows, but in shows that are supposed to be news. And sometimes it's questionable whether it's real or not.
Yeah. There's a lot of fiction that poses as non-fiction.
Right. Yeah. Let me see. Okay, this one, there's no name here. They say, I've been such a huge fan of MASH. I had a question for Alan. You wrote, directed, and starred in the series. Was there a particular position that you feel you got more out of, or were they all equal? Your writing, directing, and acting are all inspiring.
Well, thank you. That's a nice thing to say. I loved doing all of those things, and it was a wonderful opportunity for me to get better at doing them. And I went on to direct and write movies after that. But I can't say I liked one more than the other. Directing is not what it's cracked up to be, because you have to answer 200 questions every hour.
Mhm.
Every department comes up to you and says, "You want the red or the blue?" I don't give a damn. Just put it in.
Come back into the frame.
No, I didn't
I'm
like the
directing
question.
you. Come back,
I'll be
back
over here.
in.
Well,
Here
I come
are.
in, you go out. What is this?
Okay.
Let me see here. This one's from David. Have you read E.L. Doctorow's wonderful book of the Bronx during World War II, the World's Fair? If so, what did you think of it?
Yes, but I can't recall, but I was a big fan of Ed Doctorow's, and of course he was a Bronx boy as well.
Mhm.
And we were privileged to know him. He's a wonderful guy, and I just loved his writing.
Yeah.
Very textured and palpable and insightful and beautiful.
Okay. This one is from Alan Isaac. Mr. Alda, I read and enjoyed your book. If I understood you, would I have this look on my face?
Come
I am
this
a
way.
speech therapist, and as such, I'm curious if you have at any time collaborated with speech pathologists, because the exercises and methods you espouse address what is referred to as social pragmatic skills.
No, I never had, and I never have, and I didn't know about the ideas and terms he's talking about. I'll have to look it up. Tell him thank you. I'll
Yeah.
tell him thank you.
There you go. Let me see. This one's from Susan. She says, I'm a retired elementary teacher. About 3 years ago, my class and I did the Flame Challenge with you at Burr Intermediate School in Colmac. My students love the experience. Thank you for your passion in science and the importance of communication of science to others. So that really wasn't a question, but she says thank you.
So if people don't know what she's talking about, a few years ago, for several years, we had a contest for scientists to answer a question about nature, like what is a flame, in a way that 11-year-olds could understand it and be engaged by it. And they'd win the contest if the judges voted them the best. And the judges were all real 11-year-olds.
Oh my
So
God.
it was exciting for both sides.
Yeah, I'm
It was a great, and it was ongoing for quite a few years. Each year there was a different question for the Flame Challenge. It was wonderful.
I like that. At any time, if you have questions, just drop them down at the Ask a Question button down below the stream. We have time for some more. Iris asks, what is one piece of career advice you would give my daughter who is studying theater arts and media in college?
I advise everybody. There's all kinds of things you can advise, like be prepared to be turned down, be prepared to support yourself somehow while you're waiting to get to be known. But the most important advice I think I can give is make sure you have a life partner who shares your values. And then, of course, you have to figure out what your values are so you know if that person shares them. But if you don't have that, you're adrift, because a lot of people want to exploit you.
Mm-hmm.
And you got to know what's in your deepest self-interest. That's what I think.
That is good
And
advice.
I got one here.
Yeah, I think you guys did pretty good.
You know, we're not getting paid for this, so I only am showing half my face.
Come in.
No, you're good. You're good. You're in the shot. Let me see here. This one's from Helene. Where did your love of science come from while you were in MASH? Did that increase your love of science?
No, a lot of people think that it did. I don't think it really contributed at all. I was interested in science or figuring out how things got the way they are
Mhm.
since I was a little child. Partly it was because, oddly enough, my mother was schizophrenic and paranoid and had her own version of reality. And from the time I was very small, I had to figure out what reality was and what was just her reality.
Mhm.
So I got very good at observing people, which I've been talking about all night, and relating to people, but also trying to exercise my curiosity about why are things the way they are.
Mhm.
So that's the basis of my interest in science, I think.
All right, we will accept it.
Here's the other
Um,
half of my face. I don't want you to think I had an accident over here.
What is, let me see here. What is the key to a successful marriage, Teresa?
Arlene has the answer to the secret of a long marriage.
Is a short memory.
I love that. That's amazing.
That's one to ponder.
Perfect answer. I'm going to use that later down the line. Oh, I like this. Rich Cassone would like to know, Arlene, what's the best thing about Alan? And Alan, what's the best thing about Arlene?
Oh,
Pick
Alan's
one.
a good listener.
Oh, that's nice. I've thought a lot about this, and I'm always embarrassed to say it out loud because it sounds goopy. But the best thing about her, I think, is that she really knows how to love somebody. It's really nice being loved by her.
Yeah. I mean, I can tell by the way that you look at each other that you're definitely in love. Look, he's doing it now.
He's a good actor.
I could tell that's not acting. Let's see. I guess this one is from Roger. I chose to attend college at Fordham University in the Bronx, partly because Mr. Alda was alum. I always loved when Hawkeye's character mentioned the Fordham seismic station on MASH. Do you have a favorite Fordham story?
Oh, that's one of the few areas I can't remember a story about. A Fordham story. No, I can't. Did I ever tell you a Fordham story?
Not really.
There is some peculiar thing about the time. I don't know if it's true anymore about Fordham, but I was in the arts. I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to be an actor, and I majored in English. But you couldn't get a Bachelor of Arts degree there at that time unless you could speak Greek and Latin.
Mm-hmm.
So they gave me a Bachelor of Science in Social Sciences.
Maybe that's where your interest in science came
from.
I
had to live up to the piece of paper.
I had to live up to the piece of paper.
All right. Well, it is 8:00, and I want to thank you both so much for being here. I don't think I've laughed this hard in a really, really long time. This was such a thrill for me. I hope that you guys enjoyed it as well.
Thank you. I did, and I bet Arlene did too.
Thank you so much,
and
Lauren.
Thanks to all the people who are watching. It's so nice that you tuned in.
Yes.
Thank you all. Thank you. Good night. Good night, Alan.
Good night, Arlene. Good night, John Boy.
It's backwards.
Click the button right below. And thank you to Roger Rosenblatt for
thank you, Roger.
Yes.
Here's my book, When I Had Hair.
All right. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thank you for tuning in.